Hello one and all, Jasper here, and this has been a video that I know you guys have been looking forward to, but I didn't know how best to tackle it. I was tempted to make it a top 10 list, but I felt that would be kind of boring, because despite there being so many castles in Westeros, you would all know who the 9 best castles are, and none of the minor castles would really be able to be talked about. So instead, I decided to make a tier list and talk about 24 of the most prominent castles in Westeros. At least those we have a somewhat decent idea on how they're structured. Yeah, the crazy thing is, many famous castles that we all know about, we don't actually know about. Take Driftmark, for example. Everything that we could guess about it is show only, and I pride myself on judging these things on the books. So, sadly, popular castles like Last Hearth, Seaguard, and Stonehenge cannot be judged. Sorry, Aegir Bittersteel 2154, I know that last one must really hurt you. Now, you might be curious on how I am judging these castles, and I think the best way is on the geographical location and the layout of the castle. I will not be considering any titles that come with it. For example, I will judge Riverrun on its defenses, but I will not assume that by being given Riverrun, I will be the Lord Paramount of the Riverlands. After all, the Freys were given Riverrun after the Red Wedding, but were not given the title of Lord Paramount. You feel me? So we will assume I will be made subservient to whoever they want to place in charge of the region. Enough wasting your time though, let's get started with these castles. Starting in alphabetical order, we have Casterly Rock, which is going to be an S tier, no questions asked. The fact it's a castle carved into a mountain would alone make it one of the toughest nuts to crack, and arguably the only castle one could say is dragon-proof. Eat your heart out, Harrenhal. Throw in that it is a coastal castle, meaning one would need both an army and navy to siege it properly, and I haven't even commented on the vast amount of gold mines that rest with it. Money may not be everything, but it sure does help in most situations. Not only is this S tier, but it very much may be the best castle in this entire lineup. But we'll have to wait till the end of this video before we can really say that for certain. On to the next one, we have Castle Black, the most prominent castle of those under the control of the Night's Watch. And since we started with an S, it only makes sense that the next one is an F. I know some of you may be surprised that such a prominent castle in the story is at the very bottom, but let me explain. First off, Castle Black isn't much of a castle, since one side of it is walled. Granted, that is a big ass wall, but let's be real here, once you're over 100 feet, you're just trying to show off. You could shave off 300 feet from that damn thing to cover the other sides and still have 400 feet to protect yourself from wildlings. Now, I get it. Castle Black and many of the other castles on the wall are not protected from the south because they are not supposed to be attacked from the south. They are supposed to be subservient to the south. But that didn't stop the wildlings from doing it when Mance tried to go beyond the wall by sending a couple little excursions over. Throw on top that its location really sucks. I mean, there are reasons why it's treated more as a prison camp than any actual people wanting to go there. Probably the worst place in all of Westeros to be. I rest my case. Alrighty, here's Dragonstone, which is probably the most unique looking castle in the entire realm, created with old Valyria magic, which I want to call bullshit on because more likely they used their dragons to melt stone and drip it out like a dribble castle at a beach because our families were either too poor or cheap to buy buckets to make a proper castle. I'm sorry, that came out of nowhere. Anyways though, it shouldn't be a big surprise though, given the heritage, that there are a fuck ton of dragon stuff in this castle. Now don't get me wrong, dragons are cool, but this crosses a line and delves into fetish territory. I mean, for Christ's sake, they have small dragons framing gates, dragon claws holding torches, a pair of wings covering the armory and smithy, dragon tails forming archways and staircases, and doors being set in the mouths of stone dragons. It is a little much, but if you can get over that, or heck, get off on that, then it's not terrible. After all, being an island castle means if you could get a decent navy going, it would be a bitch and a half to siege. Though even without one taking the castle would not be an easy task, though that is the bare minimum for any castle really. There is some prestige in having the castle the Targaryen heirs would often rule over until it was time for them to take control of the Seven Kingdoms, though that honor wasn't enough to make Stannis think the castle was all that great. Then again, he was comparing it to Storm's End, which just isn't fair. It is a bit of a poor place though. Much of the business at Dragonstone is fishing, and its location could in theory make it a decent option for trade. However, thanks to the existence of King's Landing, Duskendale, and Driftmark, that is likely never going to happen. This feels harsh, but honestly, I have to give it a D ranking. It does the bare minimum of what a castle is expected to do. Really, you can only justify loving this castle if you're a Scaly. Also, a pure black castle feels very doom and gloom to me. Though it's not nearly the gloomiest castle. That probably goes to the Dreadfort. I mean, for fuck's sake, the castle has skeleton hands holding torches. This is the kind of castle you would see being set up at Hot Topic. Regardless of that though, it's a powerful castle with thick walls, and given its location on the map, it isn't half bad, right next to the Weeping Water. So you have easy access to the ocean at large, so traveling by comparison to other northern houses would be quick if you need to head south for whatever reason. Location-wise, being a castle located on the eastern side of the region means you don't have to worry much about the Ironborn. You're far enough north that most people won't even bother to raid or attack your lands, but not so far north that you have to worry about wildlings, at least by comparison to the Umbers. And hey, even though I'm not as edgy as I used to be in high school, I still love me some heavy metal, so the skeleton torches might be pretty badass. A solid B tier castle. Let's go even further north, back to the wall where we have Eastwatch by the Sea. And I won't waste any of your time, it's going to F tier as well, though higher than its brother, Castle Black. Most of my gripes with Castle Black would be the exact same, but at least Eastwatch is next to the damn ocean, so travel and trade would be more fruitful. Still, a piss poor option. We're going to be really jumping up in quality though, as now we have the Golden Tooth, one of the few castles we know anything about in the Westerlands. It's described as small, which by Georgia standards must mean it's only twice as big as a real castle, instead of 4 times. It is mentioned that the Golden Tooth does have its own gold mine, not as vast or impressive as Casterly Rock, but it exists. Loses some points, however, for being a front lines castle. If shit hits the fan and enemies attack the Westerlands from the east, then this castle is the first in line to hold everyone off. But hey, you might get lucky and they'll find a goat path to ignore you and attack your neighbors. Maybe put a sign there and hey, point it out to them. I think C is a fair place for it. Hey, any chance you live in Florida, then you'll probably love Greywater Watch, perfect for drifting around the bayou. Goodness gracious, of all the castles that are in Westeros, this one is probably the most bullshit of the entire series. I could imagine if you got some really bored construction workers and threw enough money at them, they could make all of the castles we have talked about so far and will talk about later. But not Greywater Watch, because this motherfucker floats. Now obviously, Greywater Watch is not a traditional castle. No way in hell this thing is built of stone or has walls. It has to be made of wood for this to even be reasonable, which means that if the enemy comes across this castle, you're in trouble. Thing is, good luck finding it because apparently this fucker moves. It's impossible to find with ravens, and those who have tried only succeeded because the Crannogmen let them. If you're invading these lands, you better just forget about getting the castle and just book it through the neck to get out as soon as possible, because your army will fall prey to sinkholes, diseases of all sorts, and non-stop guerrilla warfare from the Crannogmen with poison darts. That's if the lizard lions don't get them, which guess what? They are also venomous. Sounds like a great castle, right? Fuck no. I am a desert boy. You think I'm going to enjoy being in this sludge society? I wouldn't last a week before something killed me, and I refuse to believe that Greywater Watch actually exists. I imagine House Reed lives in a rather impressive thatch hut, which is in the end of the day still a thatch hut. This is going in F tier for me. You know, it's been a while since we talked about a capital of a region, so let's talk about Highgarden. A very impressive fortress with 3 layers of white walls, each one taller than the last, a briar labyrinth between the first and second one that can entertain guests or slow invaders, and it being located at the Mander, giving it easy access to the ocean or even traveling through a good chunk of the Reach. Fertile lands to farm, as we shouldn't forget that there is a reason why the Tyrells are the second richest family in the Seven Kingdoms, and I'm sure a good reason for that is that location. If I was a sellsword who bumbled his way into this castle for no good reason, I wouldn't complain. Maybe I could even be named Master of Coin just for owning it. It's an S tier castle, though real fast, that Briar Labyrinth wouldn't do shit against attackers. You just have to set it on fire and then poof, no more worries about trying to figure out how to get through the maze. Still, that isn't enough to knock it down a level at all. I kinda like the Reach, so let's stick around a bit and talk about another castle. Ooh, Horn Hill, the main seat of House Tarly, and what we have here is, in my eyes, the perfect C-tier castle. Its location isn't extraordinary, but it isn't bad. The castle itself is described as strong, though less formidable than Old Town. No easy access to water source, but you still have the fertile lands of the Reach to farm and hunt. Yep, a perfectly average C-tier castle. You know, I haven't been able to talk about any of the castles in the Riverlands, so let's fix it with Harrenhal, which would need a lot of fixing to get it to a livable condition. Honestly, this would be the only house I would outright refuse. I don't consider myself a stupiditious person, but when your castle is famous for ending the lines of 6 families in the span of just over 200 years, that's a family gone roughly every 40 years. Maybe I could skirt around the curse, never go into it, have it torn down and build a new castle, since hopefully Harrenhal would come with all the fertile lands of the area. That would be expensive as fuck though. I would technically be homeless for probably a decade as the new castle is built, but that's too risky for me even then. Bottom of the F tier, as it is probably the only castle that can kill me. If this was before it was turned to a melted wax figure though, top of S. Fuck, I already regret leaving the Ridge. Let's go back and talk about Old Town. It is the largest and richest city in the entire kingdom. Only the likes of King's Landing and Lannisport would be able to argue against that, but still, getting the bronze medal in this competition doesn't matter, as you could still easily afford to dip it in gold. Large, massive walls to protect it, the main hub for the educating of maesters, a massive trade hub located near the ocean. I mean, come on, who cannot put this baby in S tier? People just assumed that when Aegon took over most of Westeros, that he would choose Old Town as his seat of power, not Casterly Rock, not Highgarden, not Harrenhal, or any other options. Old Town. Granted, he didn't pick it and just decided to make his own, but still, this is a place that should not be slept on. There is a good reason why the Hightowers are tied for first place in wedding Targaryen kings, if you ignore House Targaryen itself with all the incest. Alright, let's travel over to the Iron Islands and talk about Pike. From a purely defensive case, I think you can make a strong argument for Pike being the most pain-in-the-ass castle to siege. Its walls are not as strong or impressive as many we talked about, but the fact that the keep itself and each tower is on its own island with simple rope bridges connecting them, it's honestly a miracle that Robert was able to storm the castle so effectively and take it, as if Balon had the wisdom God blessed a trout, he would have fallen back to said towers and cut the ropes to the bridges, making it damn near impossible for attackers to continue forward. That will sadly be where my praises end though, as Pike sits on pretty much a barren rock, with hardly any fertile lands to speak of. The only real wealth these islands produce is iron, which can be great for arming soldiers, but you'll have to trade most of it for food and wood, since raiding and taking what you want won't be an option as long as the 7 kingdoms stay united under one realm. Meaning, I would likely have to sail all the way to Essos to take part in raiding, which does not sound very pleasant to me. I am much more of an Andal than an Ironborn guy. Because of these issues I have, I'm going to put it in B tier. It's better than average, but it wouldn't be my first, second, or even third choice. Raventream Hall seems to be up next. Again, sorry Aegor Bittersteel 2154, but we actually get to see this castle in the books. It's a formidable castle, the last one to surrender to the Lannisters after the Red Wedding, if I recall correctly. A strong stone wall covered in moss with 2 large square towers flanking the gates and another tower at each angle of the wall. It even has a moat in front of it for further defense. This all to me seems like a perfectly average castle. Its location doesn't add much to it, though it does not take away either, as the Riverlands are naturally very nice and quite fertile. Though being in the Riverlands pretty much means when a war kicks off, your shit is going to get fucked up. I'll give it C. Oh boy, Now we're at the capital of all capitals, King's Landing, one of the richest cities in the world with a wonderful location in regards to trade. Honestly, give it a few more centuries and I promise it will surpass even the wealth of Old Town. Thick walls surround the city itself, and let us not forget that the Red Keep is a formidable fortress in its own right. A massive fortress. Some of the towers such as Maegor's Holdfast are bigger than other castles on this list. But there are some questions this brings up. If I am given this castle, would I be king? Or would the king be giving this to me and naming some other place as his capital? This is a bit different compared to the other castles we've gone over. Makes it a bit more difficult to judge this, but I think either way, it has to be an S. It's a powerful castle city fortress with rich lands, tons of trade, easy access to the ocean. So long as I keep my head down and don't piss anyone off, then it will definitely be worth it. Riverrun, by comparison, is much less complicated though, and of all the region capitals, this probably is the least impressive. You see, the Tullys were never kings of the Riverlands, and thus never had the wealth to make amazing fortresses that compared to other capitals, and is also a bit on the smaller side. Yet, it's still a damn good castle. Any castle that allows you to turn yourself into an island fortress would be a monster to try and take. Plus, its location in the Riverlands is great, but again, terrible during wartime. Peace, fantastic. If I play my cards right and pull off the old reliable Switzerland tactic, I might get out of most situations unscathed. A tier. The Shadow Tower. The final castle that the Night's Watch controls, and this one is going into D tier. It has all of the weaknesses the others have, and in fact, Eastwatch by the Sea is arguably better. But the Shadow Tower is a baller name, so there you go. Here we go. We have our first Dornish castle. Starfall, the home of House Dane. We don't know much about the actual structure of the castle itself, but we do have quite a bit of knowledge in regards to its location. Resting right at the mouth of the Torrentine River, and you all know how much I love rivers, it can make your life so much easier in these harsh times. The Dornish lands can get quite warm, but hey, I'm a Deseret. I can handle the temperature. I'll just bitch about it constantly. Luckily, I'll have a river nearby to cool me off. Another big plus is Starfall is kind of out of the way from most places. If you're coming to fuck up Dorne, you'd have to go out of your way in order to mess with my shit. I want to give it an A tier, but that doesn't seem super fair given how much our guesswork is to the layout. So, high B. One of the most famous castles in all the land, considered to be the strongest of the entire realm. Most castles, it's smarter to starve those out. With Storm's End, you pretty much have to starve them out. Walls 100 feet tall, 40 feet thick at its weakest point. Breaking through is impossible. A single massive tower that houses everything you will need comfortably. From a purely defensive case, you would be hard-pressed to pick a better castle. Its location, though, isn't fantastic. Despite it being close to the ocean, because of the rough seas and jagged rocks, you're not going to get much trading that way, and the Storm's lands has always been a bit underdeveloped when compared to the other regions of Westeros. Still, the defenses alone keep it at a nice, solid S tier, though admittedly, at the lower end. Back to the blazing lands of Dorne, and did you really think I wouldn't talk about Sunspear? 3 massively windy walls that defend the castle, along with being located near the ocean, which allows, and say it with me this time, okay? Gives easier access to trade with the rest of the world. Good job. Throw on top that for a land army to make it to you, it has to travel through some of the hottest and harshest deserts on the continent, and it makes complete sense why it's the capital of the region. Issue is, I need to be critical a little bit in regards to how much access it has to the ocean. Because given the massive shoreline it has, it's impossible for Sunspear to defend themselves from naval invasions, which practically circumvents any issues one might have when attacking Dorne through land. Old Town has this weakness by comparison, but if you check the geography on the map, its shoreline is so much smaller by comparison. Bigger than a river, but still possible to defend any point of the opening to the ocean. Sunspear does not have such a luxury, so I'm afraid I'll have to put it only in A tier. A great castle that probably would have been perfect if it was, for example, at the end of the Scourge River. We haven't tackled a single castle from the Vale yet, so let's open up with a banger. The Eyrie. capital of the Vale and considered to be the most impregnable castle in the entire kingdom. And for good reason, because when it comes to natural defenses, it's hard to get much better than mountains and narrow passages. Starving it out would be very difficult, as its food stocks rival that of other castles, and since it can afford to have a much smaller garrison, because the castle itself is actually small as well, to protect itself, it would very much likely take decades before the defenders would start to get hungry. Seems like prime S-tier candidate, right? Well, there is one thing that personally makes me think it should be lower, and that is because of the land it directly controls. It doesn't strike me as being very self-sufficient. I get the feeling that the Eyrie can only exist as it is because it has the wealth of the entire Vale to back it up. Keep it well supplied and garrisoned. If the castle is given to me and is no longer the capital of the region, I think it very well could be difficult to keep it to its such formidable state. Still, even in the worst case scenario, it would still be a monster to deal with, so I'm going to put it at the highest A tier. Perfect for wartime, but it falters in peace when it can only depend on itself. Now, how about we talk about the Pinky? You might be asking yourself, what is the Pinky? I never heard of that castle. Well, it is the name that I have chosen to give to the seat of power for House Baelish. Often called the Drear Fort, it's located on the smallest bit of land that is called the Fingers. I think the Pinky is a perfect name, and that alone is enough to give it an S tier in my book. Okay, in all seriousness, it's a bit of a dog-shit castle, which is kind of funny because it's probably one of the most realistic castles in the entire show. Or books, I should say, my bad. Might even be average by real-world standards given the period, or slightly less. Sadly, this isn't a real world. This is a fantasy world with castles that are 5 times larger than some of the biggest castles of our own world. I can't quite give it an F tier though, as given its location and the fact it isn't a very important castle, I don't have to worry about someone going out of their way to fuck with me. You see, I don't want to always be the tallest flower in the garden, as those are often plucked. What I want is to remain in the dirt, and this castle does accomplish that at the very least. Still, that only bumps it up to a D tier. Oh man, am I seeing double? Because we now have the twins to talk about, and look, honestly, I think people kind of sleep at just how prominent this castle is because they hate the Frey so much. It's entirely because of this castle the Freys are as powerful as they are. In just 600 years, which on the grand scale of some of the other prominent nobility families of Westeros is so small. All these fuckers have had thousands of years to rise in power and wealth, and thanks to the twins, the Freys do it in a fraction of the time. You could even say they are the most powerful family in the Riverlands. Only the Tullys compare because Aegon named them as Lord Paramount of the Riverlands, and thus get to leech off the other noble families, including the Freys. Plus, let's be real here, taking the castle would be a nightmare. You would need to lay siege on both sides, otherwise supplies could be brought in to sustain the garrison. And even if you do siege both sides, you get a massive ass river that they could still fish off to feed themselves, or at the very least, make their supplies last longer. Other places like Riverrun have similar access to fish, however, considering that they would be at risk of arrow fire, the twins do not have such a risk. Throw on top that it just prints money because of the toll you can charge for crossing, and I don't see why I should put this any lower than A tier. Just 2 more now, and they're both in the north. And it's kind of funny that we're saving the most famous for last, but we'll get to that later. Here is White Harbor, the city in the north ruled by House Manderly, where the castle itself is called Newcastle, which is a stupid fucking name. You've been shagging up in the north for about 1,000 years now. I don't think your castle is very new anymore. Either way, like with some of the other castles, we gotta of course talk about the city because it's a package deal, which only helps it because it's one of the wealthiest cities on the continent. I think specifically number 5, which by Westeros standards is pretty impressive, and by Northern standards, they might as well be Lannisters. Easy access to the ocean, and like Old Town though, the natural geography begins to narrow it out as it gets closer to White Harbor. So, any naval invasions are going to be a pain to deal with. Though, even if it didn't have that, White Harbor has its own impressive navy. Not to the levels of the Royal, Arbor, or Iron fleets, but definitely enough to give them pause, and to straight out deny any other families from a direct attack. Something that Sunspear lacked because their dumbass queen burnt all their ships for no good reason. We haven't even talked much about the structures, have we? Well, no surprise, a large wall surrounds the city to protect it from invaders, and Newcastle itself is pretty well defended as it's surrounded by the city, and it sits atop the hill. Though, that's nothing too crazy. Though, it's clearly a prize that anyone with any sense would want. I think I'll give it a high B. And finally, the last castle we'll be talking about. You know it, you love it. It's the home of the Starks. We have Winterfell, a complex where the outer wall encloses several acres of land. How many exactly is hard to say. The only concrete number we get is that the Godswood, which is inside of the castle walls, are 3 acres. So now we have to wonder what percentage of Winterfell is the Godswood. Either way, I think including Winterfell, a conservative estimate would be 12 acres, though it could very much be as high as 50 acres, as that's the size of some of the largest castles in Poland. Funny enough, though, what I would consider to be bad things about castles, Winterfell actually takes advantage of. It does not have easy access to the sea, but that means your only real way of attacking it is by land. And given the vast stretches of cold, harsh, inhospitable lands, the siege of the castle itself would probably be easier than getting to it. And this isn't even in purely winter times. Even during summer, the weather can be cold and harsh. If winter actually comes, then there's no hope in coming out at all. The castle itself is also built on geysers that pump through the castle to keep it warm, so you wouldn't need to worry about running out of wood to keep things, toasty. And when it comes to those massive-ass walls that are, I think, 100 feet tall, which is ludicrous by realistic standards, and also, I'm throwing this out there ain't no fucking way that Theon Greyjoy would take this castle with 20 men. Piss off, the population of this castle would have to be several hundred. You're not holding that. With all that going for it, though, I mean, I have to give it an S tier. It's obvious, but, yeah. Sometimes the obvious answers are obvious for a reason. And there we go. I think that's enough castle ranking for now. Please make sure to comment below on your thoughts. Did you agree or disagree? Do you think some castles should be higher or some should be lower? Please, I make sure to read every single comment. And if you want to watch more, make sure to like, share, and subscribe so that way you don't miss any future videos that come out. Until then, be safe and have a wonderful night.